Let's see if I can spot Brian here yet today. All right. Let me go ahead and give a welcome and a few introductory remarks. We have a really packed agenda today, so I want to be sure that that I don't take any time from our great panel of people. Our topic today is protest, police, and policy. Be part of the change. Why this topic? We started to think about doing this when George Floyd died, and that it was important to have this conversation. And we are especially having this conversation today because we really believe Black Lives Matter. I'm sure all of us on the call agree about that. And we are very pleased today to have as our panel Jay Shepard from Action St. Louis. Jay is a 27-year-old Black, queer, non-binary, messy work in progress. Love that description. As a non-binary person myself, I just may have to steal part of that and be a messy work in progress too. Jay is the abolition organizer at Action St. Louis and daydreams of divestment from police and prisons and investment in a St. Louis where Black people have the resources and care to thrive. We also have Betty Frizzell, who has served as a deputy sheriff in 2 rural Missouri counties and was police chief in Winfield, Missouri. Now retired from that, she teaches as an adjunct professor in criminal justice and is author of a book called If You Can't Quit Crying, You Can't Come Here No More, A Family's Legacy of Poverty, Crime, and Mental Illness in Rural America. She has offered testimony in Missouri on some bills that we care about, including the HIV Policy Modernization Bill and the House Bill 12 this week about certification of juveniles, and that was on behalf of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. We also will have Senator Brian Williams, who represents the 14th Senatorial District in St. Louis County. He grew up in Ferguson and attained his undergraduate degree from Southeast Missouri State University and earned master's degrees in public administration and legal studies from WashU. He's also been a congressional staffer and oversaw the rollout of the Affordable Care Act marketplace in Missouri. And then batting cleanup will be Sara Baker, the legislative and policy director for the ACLU of Missouri. She's responsible for working with elected officials and community organizations on issues related to the rights of all Missourians. She also served as special projects manager and Stephen M. Rivers Memorial Fellow at the Center for Democracy in the Americas in Washington, D.C. While there, she worked a lot with women organizing in Cuba and worked directly with high-level congressional delegations to Cuba. I would love to hear about that sometime. I used to be part of a church that had a sister congregation in Cuba, so it's a warm place in my heart there. I want to remind you of some basics about webinars on Zoom. To mute and unmute yourself, you can click on the icon of the microphone in the lower left of the screen or the mute unmute option in the upper right of your own square. If you're on a telephone instead of on the computer, use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. To improve sound quality, we ask everyone to stay muted when you're not speaking. If you have questions or comments, feel free to post them in the chat feature. I'll also open it up to people to unmute themselves and ask a question aloud later. After each person presents, there'll be about 5 minutes for Q&A. And there'll be a recording of this webinar available on our website at the events tab not too long after we're done with the webinar. And feel free to share that link with others if you found what happened here today helpful. So are there any questions before we get started? All right. Well, I see that there are about 36 on currently. We have quite a few more registered than that. 38 people are still coming in. That's great. Welcome, everyone. You're on the Empowering You webinar. We're about to start with our first speaker, who is Jay from Action St. Louis. And we're celebrating with Action St. Louis that the Close the Workhouse campaign had a successful outcome. Empower Missouri endorsed Close the Workhouse. We only did a little bit compared to what Action St. Louis did on that issue, but we were proud to be in solidarity with you. So thank you, Jay, and take it away.
Thank you, JMO. Great to be here. Thanks for shouting out closed the workhouse. It was a 2.5 year effort that we started out with very, very few community support and garnered widespread community support and had a 28-0 unanimous vote in the Board of Aldermen. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about why protests are going on right now and where action is with policing. So we know that the unjust killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and others have reignited protests across the country and here in St. Louis. People are taking to the streets to demand justice for the murders of Black people by the police. And the issue of police violence and brutality isn't new. It didn't start with George Floyd or Michael Brown in 2014. Police have always been used as a tool for social control, and modern day policing, had this origins in slave patrols and colonial police forces. So we really need to be asking why police act as first responders for all societal social problems. Why should we have these, trained entities to use excessive force be in our schools with our youth, addressing mental health crises, homelessness, drug use, and be the end all means to addressing all these issues. So Action St. Louis right now is calling for the defunding of the police. And most folks are like, what does that mean? How do you defund the police? So defunding the police is this process of reallocating funds and responsibilities from the police department to community-based systems of safety, prevention, and de-escalation. So much like we did with the Close the Workhouse campaign, where we advocated to defund this jail and reallocate funds into community care. So yeah, it's stripping away these systems that are carceral and punitive and murdering and incarcerating Black people, and instead putting funds into community needs. Right now, St. Louis's proposed 2021 budget allocates $137 million to the police department and $0 to homelessness. That directly shows what our city values. Instead of throwing away hundreds of millions of dollars into this failed arrest and incarcerate model each year, we seek to get down and address the real root of crime, because police aren't solving crime. They're not stopping crime. So we are asking for the removal of police from systems like accident response and traffic enforcement, from domestic and intimate partner violence responses, mental health crises, homelessness outreach, drug use and overdose response, schools, redirecting funds to alternatives outside of the police department, such as like traffic accident investigators and trained domestic violence counselors and mental health professionals, outreach workers, housing providers, substance use counselors, street nurses. Instead of having police in our schools, what if we had peer walking counselors? We are seeking to reduce the police department's size and scope and impact, and terminate units of or patrols that enforce this quality of life offenses and target protesters, and are tasked with over surveilling Black communities. We're seeking to disarm, decommission, and dismiss officers who cause community harm. We're seeking to enact budget and hiring freezes to the police department. And right now, respond to community harm with community-based resources, right? So, like I said, addressing and getting down to the root causes of crime and conditions by investing in affordable housing, education, medical care, mental health care, public spaces, violence prevention programs. And that's kind of where we are right now in our campaign to defund the police. We recently put up a petition alongside many other organizations, Ford to Ferguson, We Power, Empower Missouri, OBS, which calls for these demands and targets Mayor Lyda Crewson, Board of Aldermen, President Lewis Reed, Controller Darlene Green, Public Safety Director Jimmy Edwards, to really enact these changes to demand the No CARES Act funds for COVID-19, which we know that COVID-19 predominantly disproportionately impacts Black St. Louisans, and that relief not go to the police department. Again, looking at these hiring freezes, again, calling for the immediate release of the full, most detailed line item budget for the St. Louis Police Department, which right now we have not been able to get our hands on. So we can't really say how, like, ask and demand where money go to when we can't even see what funds are going to right now. So I'm gonna drop this in the chat, which is the petition. And ask that you all take a look at our demands and sign on. Yeah, and open it up for questions.
Can we just unmute and ask?
Sure, go ahead, Karen.
Hi, Jeanette, thanks. Hey, thank you very much, Jay. How is the Cure Violence, what was dedicated to Cure Violence in the initial round, how could that play in, or is that not a factor from where you sit, or could it be?
Oh, for sure. So Cure Violence is for actions. Cure Violence is something that we've always signed on to as this model to, in this like invest, divest system, invest into actual community care. Cure Violence would be addressing the root causes of crime and doing that from the standpoint of the folks in those areas, the folks that are most impacted by the crime in those areas. So yeah, Cure Violence is, yeah, it is something that we, a proponent of investment, that we are stating to divest from those systems and invest into systems like Cure Violence.
I'm not sure if everyone has heard of Cure Violence because we have people on from kind of across the state. Could you say a little bit about what Cure Violence is, Jay?
Yeah, so Cure Violence takes this public health approach to ending violence in neighborhoods, ending to take this public safety approach, and it's pretty widespread. It's in, I don't know the amount of states, but it's in a large amount of states have adapted this model. And we just recently are getting, Walnut Park is getting a Cure Violence, and I think Dutchtown, Southside area, and there might be one other area.
Thank you. Other questions for Jay, either ask aloud or put in the chat box. Would you spell the name of it? Cure, just C-U-R-E, Violence, Cure Violence. I think that there's a Cure Violence modeled program in Kansas City, something for peace, isn't it? Anybody from Kansas City able to share what that's called at the Public Health Department? Aim for Peace.
Aim
right?
for Peace.
Aim for Peace. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. It's kind of a different name, but it's on that model, so I think it's kind of the same thing. From Julie, what response, if any, have you received from any elected officials to your demands?
So for Close the Workhouse has a bunch of alders that are the back Close the Workhouse, and have really heavily been utilized to close the jail. And like from those alders, we've heard that, you know, they don't even have access to the police budget. And it's something that they would like to see. So there's already like certain elected officials that don't get to see what is actually happening with our tax dollars. So for most alders, we have, you know, community support, support of those alders, and are still trying to garner more within the Board of Aldermen support.
when there's a lack of transparency about a budget, that always is a big red flag, isn't it? And there's a follow-up question. Can we help put pressure on our older people, those of us who live in St. Louis?
Of course, always. So right now we are in, we haven't fully launched this defund campaign, and we're gonna come out with talking points and how you can, what you can be saying to your alder, who you should be talking to. So look for that on Action's socials, Action's website. Look out for just the further development of this campaign and what you all can be doing.
Okay, question from Alyssa. What roadblocks do you anticipate in asking for the hiring freeze, and or how do you hope to shift the support among officials? I know St. Louis officials have been very vocal and desperate about hiring for the currently unfilled police positions. This got quoted a lot in a hearing on Monday in Jefferson City, where basically the claim was we have something like 140 empty slots for the police department, and that getting rid of residency requirements would somehow solve this. I testified against it, saying that, well, number one, it's a local control issue. People in St. Louis should speak to it instead of our General Assembly. Number two, the solution is not to let some people move out of St. Louis. The solution is to invest in St. Louis so that every community is a community of opportunity instead of allowing some to flee to a community of opportunity. And then thirdly, that the situation that we have now was created through decades of aggressive public policy that segregated our country, and structural racism created the inequality that's there, and that we have to have equally aggressive decades of public policy that invest in every community if we're going to solve the situation. So I don't think that residency requirements is what is holding the St. Louis Police Department back exactly, that there are more things that they ought to be looking at. And like you, I think maybe some of that money ought to be going to some other places anyway. Alyssa's question, Jay?
Yeah, we're up against a huge fight in all of these tasks, right? But we know that adding more officers to the department does not make St. Louis safer. So having like those points to combat these arguments that, most 911 calls aren't responding to violent crimes. It's only about 4% of what police officers' jobs are. So yeah, I think that we're anticipating a lot of roadblocks from all of these demands, right? And I think that we need to still be having these big visions of reimagining public safety in our community and defunding the police. They said that closing the jail was impossible, and look at that, you know.
I'm sorry, other questions for Jay? I forgot to unmute myself. Jay, this morning in Missouri Scout, a political intelligence newsletter that we subscribe to, it talked about how so many political campaigns are using law and order as their theme this year, and are saying, we have to be very, very frightened. And basically, it looks like dog whistle racism politics to us, that there's, we've actually seen some ads that used Black Lives Matter signs as to signal who the scary people were somehow. Are you anticipating this electoral season from now to November 3rd to be an especially nasty period of time for Action St. Louis to be engaging in your work because of that kind of electoral politics?
So I think all times are going to be scary to engage in these actions to defund the police and reimagine public safety. I think that as we get smarter, so do our opponents and the people we're fighting against for these demands. I think that it will always be a point of contingency.
Stanley, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, again, I find myself in a awkward position of being biased. Much respect to Jay, one of my former colleagues, and always someone I lift up as part of the family of social justice activism. But I want to know from the ENA yesterday, if Jay was able to listen in, what is that $2 million that Mayor Crewson is talking about, and would it be allocated for the unhoused population? And can we find ways to make sure that that $16 million that we have been victorious as far as taking away from pre-detention workhouse? How can we make sure they don't find a way within the clutches of the police in the name of public safety? It's always good to share space with you, Jay. You already know that.
And Stanley's reference to something called ENA, that's the Board of Estimate and Apportionment, part of St. Louis City government.
Sorry.
Okay. That's okay. Just trying to get everybody on the same alphabet soup here.
So I didn't listen in on ENA yesterday. I'm not really sure what the 2 million you're referring to is coming from. Right now, what we're doing for Close the Workhouse campaign is talking about participatory budgeting. And so how do we use that 16 million to make sure that the folks most directly impacted by the racist policies of the workhouse are saying where that money should go and are driving that initiative, which looks like having a whole lot of conversations with people and yeah, really making sure that those funds are going to community needs and not more carceral systems. I think that can be done, and that's what we're gonna, do for the police department when we take their money, and put it into community. I think that can be done with this 2 million. If that's, I'm not sure where that's coming from. Yeah, something more for me to inquire about. Thanks for bringing that up, Stan.
There's a question from Barbara Finch from Women's Voices asking, can you discuss the fact that police officers seldom, if ever, prevent crime?
Yeah, they never do. So, right, the police come after crimes are committed, right? Like they never prevent things from happening. And typically what they respond to are things like traffic tickets and things like these like very, very petty issues and not things like murder, right? And they respond way after the fact that a crime has even been committed.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions for Jay before we turn to our next speaker. Anyone?
Yeah, I've got a question for Jay, if that's all right.
Okay, Quinn.
So just reading the petition that you sent out, most of it is pretty, I would say most of it's not very aggressive. Most of it, there's 5 demands on here. Most of it's freezing, the budget, the police budget, or not allowing them to get money through the CARES Act. So this seems pretty standard to me, and I was wondering sort of what the strategy is here, because there's some other cities that are actively defunding the police department, and obviously that's the goal, right? To start to funnel money into places that, like you said, budgets. Well, I don't know if you said this, but the implication is that budgets are about priorities, right? So prioritizing the folks that need help, generally, it's not coming from police. So I was wondering what the strategy is with the petition and why not ask for something more to maybe get met in the middle with what you're asking for now, or like what kind of the strategy was there. I mean, I think it's great, and I'm sure it's got some thought behind it. I was just curious what that was.
Yeah, so this petition was compiled from a table of other organizations that partner with us, and I think it is basic, right? Like it is things that are super achievable. Because one of them, we've already closed the workhouse, right? It's already been achieved. And for right now, I think that we need to, like, we can't really go after particular areas of the budget if we don't know and have a line item detail of the budget. So like getting these little demands to go after the funding, right? And even the funding is this like little demand to go after the full demand of abolition of the police department.
Yeah, I thought that's crazy that they're not even disclosing the line item budget.
Yeah, Quinn, you bring up kind of an interesting point as to like how far does this petition go? I would guess if you ask the majority floor leader of the House of Representatives, they would see it as being a much more radical document than you do. There's quite a continuum in Missouri. I represented a House district in St. Louis City, and I was a flaming moderate where I lived because I had to beg my constituents to vote for Barack Obama, who many of them said was a corporate tool and way too far to the right. So there's quite a continuum in our state. I served with some people who told me that they wish that when George W. Bush was the nominee, that the Republican Party had nominated a real conservative because George W. Bush was way too liberal. So they said they had to beg people to vote for George W. Bush. So there is quite a continuum in our state, and how that looks to you may not be how every Missourian sees it. Any last thought to ask Jay? And Jay, if you're able to stick around, you're certainly able to join in dialogue with folks as time goes on here, including the other speakers. So hope you can stay with us, but if you have to move on, we'll understand that too. Any last question for Jay?
If there isn't, I'm gonna drop my email in the chat and y'all feel free to email me.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'm real grateful that we had Jay on. I'm real aware that most of the progress that we have made in our world was done by young organizers. So when I see somebody's 27, I listen real carefully because really good stuff happens when people under 30 are doing organizing. So yay, Jay. All right. Betty Frizzell is with us today, and as I mentioned earlier, is an adjunct professor and works with the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. But has been a deputy sheriff and a police chief, and is the author of a book as well. So, Betty.
Hi. As she said, I'm Betty Frizzell. I'm a former law enforcement officer in Missouri. Most of my career was in Missouri, and former chief of police for the city of Winfield. I'm now a speaker for a Law Enforcement Action Partnership, but I'm also a sister of a mentally ill woman who is serving life in prison in the state of Missouri. And one of the things why I got involved with Law Enforcement Action Partnership, because we're an organization of law enforcement professionals who speak about our opposition to police violence to community members. We speak in support of the wave of nonviolent protest across the country. And we cannot uphold public safety without community trust. Without people will not report crimes, and witnesses refuse to talk to police. One of the causes of distrust in police officers is that the officers who do serious misconduct are rarely held accountable. I have for years to get Missouri police officer standard training to do more, to make a really accurate list of these officers who go from one municipality to the next municipality. They resign, or the chief just wants to get rid of the problem and make them someone else's problem. It's really prevalent in North St. Louis, where you have those really small municipalities like the Charlacs and the Olivettes and the U-City. And that causes an extreme amount of distrust in law enforcement. Second cause is that police are asked to address problems that they're ill-equipped to address to begin with, such as addiction, mental health, and homelessness. In my own case with my sister's case, which is the subject of my book, is that my sister, who had an IQ of like 68, was having a plethora of domestic violence problems in rural southeast Missouri. And us as a family, we were intervening, trying to get conservatorship of her, and then this crime happened and that ended her in prison for the rest of her life. So that is just one example of mental health issues, and that there are only 5 mental health courts, or I think it's less than 10 now in the state of Missouri, where there's over 3,500 drug courts. And as most people will know, the studies show that mental health is the start of it, and then the abuse can come in later. So the third cause of American policing is a legacy of systemic racism from the Jim Crow era to today. So in today, words are not enough. We at LEAP, we support national action because we owe equal rights to every person, regardless of background. And we must act on those values and have transparency, accountability, and safety. And we must hold ourselves to a higher standard if we honor our profession. There's always a need for a change. Even when I was in Missouri and early in my career, I saw this because I specialized in sex crimes. And as a deputy sheriff in Lincoln County, I was called in to talk to a young lady who was kicking and screaming. The other officers were threatening to mace her and to restrain her. And I just sat down and listened and used active listening skills, and come to find out she was a victim of sexual assault. And her testimony actually helped put away a serial rapist that we wouldn't have had if we had maced her and cuffed her and put her in restraints and not just listened to her. And so that's why I helped to make the first sexual assault response team made up of other professionals, healthcare professionals, and the prosecutor's office and other things, because we just can't do it by ourselves. And that's what police need to understand. They just can't do it by themselves. There has to be a psychiatrist, a addiction specialist, a mental health counselor, and you just can't arrest your way out of the problems that we've got now. So, but most police be effective when they build trust and not digging people and dragging and screaming into interview room that have been also victims themselves. One part of our reform is transparency and accountability. And the public thinks that law enforcement hides skeletons. They're not that transparent. No, working sex crimes as many years as I did, I had to keep a lot of things under wraps in my investigation. So because law enforcement operates behind closed doors, a lot of people think that they're hiding skeletons, which in some cases they might be. But if we had federal legislation to do things like Colorado has done, where they have established an independent database of officers, not just ones that do excessive force, but ones that have perjury cases against them, who have been known to destroy evidence, falsifying police reports, harassment, domestic violence. These officers are prohibited by law to be a certified officer anywhere. I've seen officers who have gotten their certification taken away in Missouri jump over the border right there by St. Louis and become Illinois officers. And if there were a federal database, that couldn't happen anymore. Congress should require that law enforcement agencies keep track of complaints and disciplinary actions. I was in England last year, and in England, you have a complaint or you have any questions, you can go ahead and just do it online. Where we don't have that. There's such a veil of secrecy, especially in Missouri, about what law enforcement, about complaints and disciplinary actions, which post needs more legislative, which police officer standard training needs more legislative piece to be able to have those come forward. But when I was chief, and even when I was working detective, a lot of the agencies just wanted to get rid of the problem and let them go to be somebody else's problem. And then we have excessive force issues, or we have other communities affected by these officers. So if Congress will require agencies to collect and report traffic stops like we do in Missouri, make that available everywhere. Like we do the racial profiling in Missouri, where every traffic stop has to be noted. And then Congress should establish a national standard for deadly force that upholds the sanctity of life, not just the landmark case, which was Graham versus Connor, which was the objective reasonableness. That's just a floor, not the ceiling. So I firmly act the duty to employ de-escalation techniques and to intervene with a police officer using excessive force. We have a force continuum as a police officer. They're supposed to start out with just officer presence and go on, but so many times we're seeing now that officers escalate right up to deadly force or to a restraint that requires a choke, and we want that to be prohibited, to use any type of airway constriction. And it requires, we want that deadly force to be required to independent prosecutors, not just someone that plays golf with. So many times I would see criminal cases be adjudicated not in the courtroom. They were adjudicated somewhere else. And like in my sister's case, her fate was already sealed before she even got there, because the judge knew the family, worked with the family. The sister was a social worker, and my sister didn't have a fighting chance in that, even if she had to change a venue. And I know, and all my years in criminal justice, being a police officer and really being proud of my profession, I'd never seen the criminal justice system bastardized like it was in rural and southeast Missouri. And that is one thing that the VERA project, VERA Institute, is saying that a lot of our new inmates that are coming into Missouri DOC are from these rural counties, because it's a money-making thing. They are able to get the money from just not the inmates, but from the families too. And then state and local changes, reform police contacts and state laws and reasonable terminations. That's the thing. If Missouri Post had more legislative duty, we did to take out that liability for chiefs and sheriffs to say that, hey, this person is terminated with cause, and this is why. And we need to keep track of this and see where this person's certification, because maybe the one is not a valid complaint, but then if they have it, we don't need to have a pattern of them. And then enacting a duty to intervene. I came from a high crime, high poverty area in rural Missouri. So I came from policing at a totally different standpoint than the other officers that I worked with. And when I would see it, I would say something, because I'm a Southeast Missouri girl, I don't know my place. So I would always have to say, listen, what is going on? Why is, but then sets the culture of the department. So if you have a chief that's not willing to say, oh, well, just don't mind that. What else is the officer to do? They can go to the FBI and start an investigation, but then that starts with recourse with the chief. So, but if the chiefs were, we had legislation where the chiefs were and sheriffs were allowed to have that duty to intervene, that you could actually report these officers, the other officers could, instead of having to stand back and have to just twiddle their thumbs or be not able to do anything because nobody's listening. And instead, an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena powers and able to monitor disciplinary actions and internal investigations. That's the thing I've seen that becoming an emergence in Missouri. Established government boards that guide police policy and clear priorities. I've seen that, but then I've seen where the new police officer, the independent civilian boards are now the chiefs are saying, well, I'm going to appoint these people. This has been the case in Springfield, Missouri, where the chief has come in and just flat out said, I don't want this person on this civilian review board. Well, what good does that do? They're the civilian, you're policing them. But so that's one thing that Missouri needs to have something to help with the police review boards and policies and procedures that are available to the public to review. I know when I took over my department, there was no policy and there was no procedure. So that left a liability to the officers, to the city, and to the community. So I had to go and I researched, I called everyone I could call. I called all the universities I could get a hold of to find out how can I make a good policy and procedure, but make it available where the public see. Is this standard policy that this officer is doing on this traffic stop? Is it what I see? Was it what you're wanting your officers to do? So that's a lot. That's part of our reform. Another part is local police practices, and no-knock warrants are a big problem. They've been since I started in law enforcement in 1997. Just recently, there was a case settled with, it was Angela Zori against St. Louis County, where she got $750,000. Officers did a no-knock warrant looking for her sons, and it ended up killing her dog. It messed up her power, her utilities, and everything else. So, and that was signed. But I can tell you no-knock warrants from my personal experience. I was the first female officer on my SWAT team in Lincoln County, and we went in. Everybody's on the floor on a no-knock warrant, and there's 2 children in the house. Okay, so but the children were scared, and now I met the daughter years later, and she was still having post-traumatic stress disorder from that no-knock warrant. So there are many things that we can do. There's cities that have implemented things where we can take those, where police can just do serious and violent crimes. I agree with the traffic stop. That's been a problem. People always, what good does that really do on a lot of things? And if we can address, get some of the duties off the police officers and have it where they are just dealing with homelessness, addiction, and mental health, especially mental health. For me, I've seen it where it doesn't work when you got police officers who don't understand the ramifications of schizophrenia or bipolar or any other mental health issue. Lots of reform needs to be done. And now I live in Seattle, I see all this stuff. It's a lot different than Missouri.
Thank you, Betty. You've given us a good list of some things that should be done, and sounds like we need to make every police department and law enforcement agency a trauma-informed agency. Would be a lot of what needs to happen. Trauma
is the basis of a lot of things, and you know, in my sister's case, if that wouldn't have been in rural southeast Missouri, she probably and had a chance to go through mental health court, she would be where she needs to be, which is in an institution getting the help she needs, instead of being in a jail where she gets that because she doesn't understand. She doesn't have mental capability to understand.
Questions for Betty? Feel free to unmute yourself or to put a question in the chat box.
Here I go, J-Mo.
Go ahead, Stan.
All right, Chief. I just wanted to really lift you up and celebrate your honesty, your vulnerability. And just to say, along the lines of women in law enforcement that really have a community forward-thinking approach, we need that. We
have some.
I know
slow moving, but we have some.
Need since law enforcement, man. We know they came out of slave patrols.
I'm sorry, I can't hear Stan.
I'm sorry. We know that law enforcement came out the history of slave patrols. So it's a lot to really reform if it can be reformed. Person that we really admire here in St. Louis is Sergeant Heather Taylor. She's the president of the Ethical Society of Police. And it's a lot of friction with her versus the Fraternal Order of Police. But you have to speak the truth. Mm-hmm. Even, I mean, we are paying the salaries of people who are victimizing and abusing the solemn oath to protect and serve, when really they are victimizing and abusing.
I'm only getting bits and pieces of Stan. I'm sorry.
I'll pass it on to J-Mo. Maybe it's on my end.
I forgot I was muted again. So thanks for your question and comment there, Stan. There was also a question from Karen. Can you hear? There's a question from Karen
Yeah, I can hear you.
saying LEAP is a national organization. Do you have allies in Missouri law enforcement organizations?
We do. We have some. It's slow moving. There was just two of us that really. I always keep close ties to Missouri, but there's also another speaker from Missouri. We try. There's a lot of officers that are very interested in us that have our same message. But the problem is, it's the police culture in Missouri. Police culture is that we need to be tougher on crime. We have more officers out there. We need to do this. But it's not working. What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same result. So we do have some interest from some law enforcement in Missouri. I might come back and run for sheriff. I don't someday.
There was a question also about your view
Where
on,
I see it's the biggest problem.
there's a question about your view on qualified immunity.
Yes, we can. We need more legislation. I'm addressing Stan's question of how can we get corrupt cops. The issue is that we don't have those in legislatively in Missouri. We need to get Missouri police officer standard training post to look at how these people are keeping their licenses and to keep track of these complaints. But a lot of times when you complain on an officer, you go in and the chief just kind of like, oh, well, whatever. Me as a chief, when I would have a roll call, like that means that the new people are coming in, the old shift is leaving, I'd have, I would have, if I seen an officer that I didn't think was quite right, I couldn't send them on the street. Because if they've been fighting at home with mom or fighting with their wife or fighting with someone, I send them out with a loaded gun. Yes, I agree. Totally agree with it. This needs a whole revamping. They need to be more transparent, needs more accountability for the officers, because St. Louis University did a great study years ago when I was starting out as an officer on muni shufflers, these people that go from one municipality to the other and just take their problems with them. And it's still a problem because there's no accountability. Post doesn't take their certification.
All right, thanks. And I'm going to go ahead and move to our next
Can't hear you.
Can everybody else hear me? Yeah, okay. Something just seems to be wrong at your place there.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. So
I know.
I will send a message to Betty, and maybe we'll about the question that we didn't get heard, and maybe we'll get an answer to that later. But we're going to turn to Senator Brian Williams, who has filed some legislation that would make some changes that may sound familiar given what you've heard so far. So Senator Williams, thank you for being with us today.
Good afternoon. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone that's on the call listening for your time. Partners that's not only been a partner with me in my office, but have done great things throughout our region and our state, like the ACLU, Empower Missouri, of course, OBS and Action, St. Louis Network. So Ms. Frizzell talked about quite a few things some things we've been working on in Jefferson City is going to cover that scope. One thing I'm excited about, especially some of my partners that have been working on this legislation with my office, I'm truly confident and optimistic that a lot of things that Ms. Frizzell and Jay and other folks have been talking about, we're going to tackle a few of those issues. Let's make it clear, it's not going to be easy, but it's something that I truly believe that we can get done. Soon, the Missouri legislature will wrap up its special session on public safety. As a Democrat, I'm in favor of everything we can do to prevent violent crime, especially gun violence, throughout our state. Unfortunately, the legislation put forward by the governor does not address violent crime before it happens. It only doubles down on the failed policy of lock them up and throw away the key, which has never worked in the past, and it won't work in the future. Until the governor and his Republican majority decide to address the root cause of crime, the chance for real change is small. That's why it's important to fight for, and I'll continue to fight for, expanding mental health services, ramping up job training in underserved communities, helping more young people graduate high school and be prepared for career or college, reinstating Missouri's background check law for gun sales. And as we know, background checks is something that's become a serious issue. And in 2007, the legislature voted for Senate Bill 62, which repealed the law that required background checks on sales and transfer of firearms. Since then, Missouri has a 25% increase in firearm homicides since they moved that forward. We also must implement police reforms, and that's going to get into what I'm focusing on in the Missouri Senate. One of those most important things that we have to do is make sure our streets are safer, and to improve the relationship between police and officers in the communities that they serve, the men and women of law enforcement, and let's be clear, law enforcement, they have very difficult jobs. And Ms. Frizzell, she understood that when she was a law enforcement officer, that, you know, and I believe that it is a job where we should ensure that there are members that protect the integrity of that profession. So it's important that we focus on reforms like banning chokeholds, requiring de-escalation training, prohibiting unnecessary no-knock warrants. As was stated earlier, I live in St. Louis County, and to give everyone just the demographics of my Senate district, I go from roughly some of the wealthiest communities in the state, like Clayton and Ladue, and then I go north through communities like Ferguson, where I grew up, Kinloch, Berkeley, and I go to the Missouri River. So it's one of the diverse Senate districts in the state, and I like to consider it the model for the state. So I have 35 municipalities that all have police departments, where I had to focus on how do we ensure that police officers aren't moving from municipality to municipality. I've also had personal experiences serving as the only Black man in the Missouri Senate, growing up and being racially profiled by police officers in municipalities where the scope of training is unprecedented. So these are things that are personal for me. We also have to work to improve police-community relations and restore the trust of the very foundation of public safety. And it's not a us versus them situation. It's simple, but reforms are embraced by law enforcement agencies across the country, and we have to figure out how to get that bipartisan support here in Missouri. So clearly, I think about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown Jr., and countless other Black men and women who should still be alive today, but we can't bring them back, and we can't prevent further deaths by passing reasonable police forms that protect all Missourians and the officers who serve them. The governor has said that he doesn't have the time to address this issue, which is really unfortunate. And I asked him the simple question when we spoke on the phone: if not now, when? And if not us, who? And we have to understand that this special session was supposed to be about public safety, and these reforms will help keep the public safe. The governor and I spoke about his witness protection program. I was one of 3 senators that voted against the governor's bill in the Missouri Senate. And the reason I voted against that bill was something like a witness protection program doesn't protect our community if there's no trust in law enforcement. Who's going to come forward and tell law enforcement who the bad actors are in our communities if they're worried about potentially being criminalized in the process? We also, in Senate Bill 16, which is the bill that I filed, we work with officers around not only post-training, but allowing discretion when it comes to bench warrants. As you know, in North St. Louis County, where I represent, we have so many different municipalities. So folks are pretty much being criminalized for being poor. We passed Senate Bill 5, and that had a lot to do with municipalities using community members as personal ATMs. So if someone has a warrant for expired license plates, and then they see a very serious crime happen in their community, it's going to deter them from going forward to law enforcement because they're going to be afraid that they may potentially be arrested in the process. We also have to understand that this is a fight that we cannot give up on. So in January, when the legislature comes back, I will file legislation with these reforms, also to address sexual assault among police officers, whether it's detaining someone or correctional officers with inmates, and hopefully to make sure that the issue remains front and center. And I truly believe that we can do this. This is something that we must do. And with continued support of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, police officers around the state, overwhelming public support, and dedicated Missourians like all of you, I'm pretty confident we can get this done.
Thank you, Senator Williams. Questions for Senator Williams?
I was just wondering how, or is it possible to somehow legislate training for police officers?
Yes, so my bill would include uniform training, which we all know is something that's extremely important. For example, if once we were working through this bill, we worked with national groups, we worked close with ACLU, and Power Missouri's been very vocal with this. When you think about police training, for example, in St. Louis, the MetroLink, we have security guard officers, and we all know that they don't receive the same type of training as law enforcement does and should. So if we set a uniform training code for police officers in Missouri, then everyone is being trained, and they can't say, well, we didn't know this, whether it's using certain de-escalation tactics, et cetera. So my bill will cover that scope, but most importantly, it'll let everyone know what the training code is and what to expect and what that accountability looks like for police officers in the entire state of Missouri.
And if I can interject right now, that's also for correctional officers, and they don't receive the same training as police officers either, and they're in there where people are being housed.
Yeah, and that's going to include anyone that's looking to work or operate in law enforcement capacity. So that's security guards, that's correctional officers, facility officers, police officers, and if you do not fulfill that training, then you would not be able to work and engage in the public in that capacity. You would have to notify a law enforcement officer. We also have language in there that addresses civilian arrest, as we know what happened with Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia and what happened with the McCloskey family in St. Louis. This just sets really a standard to where folks are not using the stand your ground law or potentially stepping within the scope of qualified immunity. They are forced to call law enforcement, and that's not pertaining to someone having a person breaking their home. We're talking about someone being on the sidewalk or on the street of your home, or if you're out in the neighborhood and you may see someone that you may perceive or may be under, maybe in a situation where you may have perceived them as doing something illegally. It's not your job to do that. You need to notify proper law enforcement to handle that situation.
So one last question. Do you see race equity as being a part of that training?
Absolutely. I mean, race, I want to be clear with everyone. For me to say that I have a comprehensive police reform bill that I believe could be passed into law in the state of Missouri as a Democrat in a predominant Republican majority, I'm the next thing close to a legislator god. And I'm not trying to sound pompous at all. We have put so much work into just getting to this point. And I think once we get this across the finish line, it's going to set precedent for us to continue to add more teeth and continue to build this. Last year in the Senate, which I have a bill that would be focusing on expungement, we passed an expungement bill that was passed through bipartisan support. This year, we're going to minimize that from a 5 to 7 year period after being removed from supervised release. And then we're going to lower the initiative petition fee from $200 to $100, and then bring in partners to help low income and unemployed folks be able to get that fee paid to get nonviolent offenses off of their records. So to think that we've done that in Missouri, and we're looking to cut that down to 2 years, and ultimately expand the scope of offenses, you know, those are things where we just have to start somewhere and we have to build it. I try my best to not give my colleagues in local government a hard time, but we have bodies of government in St. Louis that are perceived or should be the same party, and they can't even get these things done. So we got to be real with ourselves about this. And you know, and I take great pride in this because I know how hard it is and how difficult it is to get these things done with people that have no connection to communities like St. Louis and Kansas City, and they definitely don't understand the experiences of being a Black man, considering I'm the only one. So I'm grateful for the steps that our partners and we've been able to do, but that's something that's important to me, and I'm hoping if we don't get it done this year, I can come back next year and get it done.
All right, there's several questions here for Senator Williams, so let's just kind of roll through them. There was an appreciation for your mention of criminalization of the poor. Appreciate that. There's a question of ways that we can support you. Is there some support you would ask for? One thing that I would say is be sure and commit to joining every Empowering You webinar once the legislative session starts in January, because that's where we'll tell you when the hearings are going to be on Senator Williams' bill and what committee it's going to, and you know, have some talking points and things like that. But Senator Williams, are there other ways to support you that you'd like to mention?
Well, you know, we have a lot of, I noticed a lot of people, constituents of mine on the line, experts, folks who have dedicated their life to this issue around criminal justice reform and police reform. Once the session starts, we're looking to have this bill referred to the Transportation, Public Safety and Infrastructure Committee in the Senate. So anyone that can make the time through social distancing, I believe we'll still have virtual options where folks can call in and testify and talk about their experiences and their expertise around this issue before the committee once this bill comes up. It only helps to continue to inform committee members, but also help continue to build a personal connection to why it's important that we hold police officers accountable and we not allow our state to continue to discriminate and police folks because of their gender, race, or background.
Okay, question from Jessica. Are you working on decreasing funding going to the police and reallocating their work to the correct folks? Essentially, instead of training police to work with mental health, having social workers, psychologists, or others be called for that? So
right now, I've been focused on what I can do through the legislative process to improve interactions between law enforcement and the community right away. And that's why I wanted to really talk about the provisions of Senate Bill 16. For example, banning statewide bans on chokeholds will set the standard in Missouri. And then ultimately we can continue to work towards adding more teeth and tackling some additional issues that I firmly believe in, like making sure that police departments are using funding correctly and that we're not rewarding bad police departments or officers for misconduct.
Okay, and Susan Randolph asks about the Tory Sanders case. I'm not sure if you're aware of that case.
Okay, Tory Sanders case.
This is someone who died in police custody in Missouri, I think in Southeast Missouri, I believe, or South Central.
So I do remember hearing about the Tory Sanders case. And let's be clear, there's so many cases that are happening outside of St. Louis and Kansas City. I went and spoke before 2,000 activists and protesters in Springfield, Missouri, not only about police reform, but the importance of coming together as a state and advocating against bad police officers in honor and also in honor of Black lives. So I don't know all of the details in regards to the Tory Sanders case, but I have heard about it. And clearly that goes on with a long list of folks that should still be alive today.
Okay. NAACP keeps some information going, and I think that's maybe Susan is active with that, I think in Jefferson City with NAACP. Kara asks, you mentioned expanding mental health. Do you want law enforcement training in mental health or more money for mental health professionals or both?
Absolutely. So prior to serving in the Missouri Senate, and I still do serve as a board director for a community health center in St. Louis. And I've worked with members of the United States Senate, as well as local elected officials to draw in funding, whether it's for behavioral health for young people And we actually built the first community health center in the city of St. Louis to tackle behavioral health for young people. So mental health disparity has been at the center of everything that I focus on prior to serving in the Senate, and still is, and will work to make sure that we support departments like the Department of Mental Health. I work close with the Mental Health Board. Serena Muhammad, someone who lives in my district but has dedicated her career to mental health. We're hoping to be able to implement some of those policies around policing. Yeah.
Stan has posted a link to an article about a sexual assault, alleged sexual assault by a Chillicothe prison guard. Philip from Graham posted that correctional officers should have to meet standards through post like other officers, and also posted earlier some information about the city budget, the request that they've done to make more of that public. So you might want to check out his remarks on that. And there's a meeting of the Civilian Oversight Board coming up. That's a great thing for citizens to join. When we all keep our eyes on things like that, it's very helpful. So let's move on to our final speaker. I hope you can stay with us, Senator Williams, if you're able to. Otherwise, we will thank you and be talking to you later. But our
I definitely will stay on board and thank everyone for the questions, and I'm glad to be a part of the conversation today.
All right, great, thank you. Our final speaker is Sara Baker from ACLU, who is an advocate in our capital that I just admire so much. Sara works tirelessly to improve criminal justice in our state, as well as being vocal on many other social justice issues that matter to ACLU. And part of that list overlaps with what we care about at Empower Missouri. So Sara.
Thanks, JMO, and thanks to the other speakers on the call as well. My name is Sara Baker. I'm the policy director at the ACLU of Missouri. We have the auspicious task sometimes of defending the US Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, in the Missouri legislature. As you can imagine, that is pretty consistently under threat by our legislature. We tracked around 670 bills last session, and that continues to be about an average for us facing legislative session each year. I kind of want to break up what I'm going to say into three parts, and I'll try not to repeat what other folks have said because there's been so much great detail already offered on this call. I want to talk a little bit about the reform measures that Senator Williams has put forward. I want to talk about some local issues as well. And then I really want to narrow in on what's happening right now in the special session on crime in Missouri. So just to reemphasize some of what Senator Williams said, his bill, Senate Bill 16, and I posted a link to that in the chat as well, has comprehensive reforms for Missouri. If Missouri just took 3 of those things, we'd be making a giant step forward. If they took 5, we'd be ahead of the curve. This is critical to get done in Missouri and get done soon. I will say we owe an absolute huge debt of gratitude to the folks who have held the streets over the summer, who have continued pushing through protests to make sure that the pressure is on to get these reforms. I've worked in the legislature since the session after Mike Brown was killed. And I have to tell you that this is the most optimistic moment that I felt for police reform in the legislature. When Mike Brown was killed, what we saw was sort of the erection of the blue wall and just a no, no, no to reform. What we're starting to see now is a turn in public opinion and a turn even in the officers that we work with under the dome to say it's time for reform, and they want to make sure that their officers aren't seen in the same light as that officer who killed George Floyd and so many others throughout the country. So there's a real opening for reform. And even though Brian is a Democratic senator in a supermajority Republican state, I think that's part of what galvanizes the ability to make some of the changes that he has in Senate Bill 16. I'm going to give a quick list of what those are, knowing that we've gone into detail on some of them already. First, the legislation reforms no-knock warrants. Part of this is to make sure that officers are giving warning when they come into a space. Another part of it is to make sure that they're only used in combating when an offender or the person that they are pursuing is likely to be violent rather than any sort of drug offense. The case that Chief Frizzell brought up earlier was one in which there was a no-knock warrant issued for an unpaid utility bill. So clearly the offenses that are being brought before judges when considering a no-knock are a bit out of line, and we need to make sure that that tool and all of the traumatic consequences that it can have is brought under strict scrutiny going forward. Senator Williams' legislation would also ban chokeholds. It would require an independent investigation of officer-involved shooting. It would require use of force reporting. It would make reforms to how officers can use tear gas and chemical munitions. This is incredibly important to protecting First Amendment rights and the right to protest. It would have portions in it that deal with duty to intervene. Basically, if you see another officer acting in an unconstitutional way, you have to intervene. You have an obligation to step in. It would take steps to demilitarize the police. So I think many of you are familiar with federal programs that allow law enforcement departments within Missouri and throughout the country to acquire instruments of war, essentially, from the federal government that they no longer need. States like Montana actually have limited that substantially. So even conservative states have done that. And that's a direction we want to see the police head in Missouri. It would also involve making the post registry more public. This is so you know if officers are losing their certification, and to try to stop that municipal shuffle that both Brian and Chief Frizzell have brought up as well, noting that that can be really pernicious as people move from department to department. It would also eliminate the citizen arrest provision, as Senator Williams discussed. It would ban, it's interesting to say this, it would ban sexual assault on duty. What it really means is that it would ban officers and establish penalty structures for if an officer is using sexual favors coercively to say, if you do this, then you'll get off from this charge. It would establish a uniform definition of what a law enforcement officer is. Again, this is to distinguish them from other individuals who might also in Missouri be carrying a gun. And then it would have mental health provisions. So many, 9 in 10 calls that law enforcement are getting deal with nonviolent offenses. So often it's mental health issues, and they're just not the appropriate people to respond to that task. And it often results in tragic violence that could be prevented. So that's what's in Senator Williams' legislation. And I think there's a real path forward for that legislation in the Missouri Senate. Some of the local changes that I want to point to, both what Jay elevated earlier on the call, and then in the city of St. Louis, we're also looking to have community control over police surveillance. More and more, St. Louis has become a black hole when it comes to its police budget. And that includes the millions of dollars they spent on surveillance technology over the past 3 years. And just this past summer, they decided to approve a resolution that will allow St. Louis to explore spy planes in the city of St. Louis, so that we can really be watching every single movement that folks are making. I think many on this call will know that that can be detrimental to First Amendment rights. They know it can be detrimental to racial justice in the state of Missouri. And it totally upends the presumption about innocence until you're proven guilty, because it's just the government watching at all times. In the city of Kansas City, we're working on a measure to get back local control of the police in Kansas City. It's very hard to have police accountability when you lack local control. There are, of course, some stumbles that come with local control about accountability still, but you can't get even basic accountability if you're not able to hold folks accountable where you are, and instead have to constantly petition to the state for any sort of change that you want in your area. So that's kind of what's happening at the state level, and then what's happening at the local level in Kansas City and St. Louis. Now I want to talk a little bit about the special session on crime. So Governor Parson, instead of calling for a special session on police reform, which is something we would very much support doing, I think that one of the best answers to the question of why is there so much violence is another question of why is there so little trust. And part of that has to deal with the fact that there's very little trust between community members and law enforcement. And instead of deciding to call a special session on policing, the governor decided to take on quote unquote violent crime. And why I say it's quote unquote violent crime is because what we've seen in the legislation that the governor put forward is not that it's targeting violent criminals, it's that it's targeting children by and large. The legislation that's kind of become the centerpiece of the the crime package that Governor Parson is putting forward to would really just lead to more certification hearings for children who commit crimes with firearms. And so what that means is when a child is certified as an adult, they exit the juvenile system, which has been lauded across our country for the reform measures that it implements, for its trauma-informed care, for its ability to be restorative and rehabilitative, to the adult system, which does not have the same outcome, particularly when it comes to youth. They're more likely to be abused, they're isolated, they're more likely to commit suicide. And many of these youth who end up in either of those systems are facing significant mental health and substance abuse issues, which our juvenile system is well equipped to deal with and our adult system is not. And I think one of the clearest ways of looking at that problem is to know that the recidivism rate in the adult system is so much higher than it is if a child stays in the child system, in the juvenile system. It's 34% in the adult system, it's 7 to 15% in the youth system. The outcomes for children that are going through the youth system are much better because the care is developmentally appropriate for those children. And I know that there's been a lot of fear mongering about, well, these are kids who have a firearm. These are kids who've committed a violent crime. These are kids, full stop. These are kids. And they have, and the Supreme Court has recognized, a transformative ability for change. They have a transformative ability to react to therapies and to move forward with their lives. And some of them exit the youth system and go on to college and go on to be full members of society. These are children who are generally coming out of extremely traumatic situations themselves and need our help, not to be locked up behind bars. One of the most shocking things that I learned when delving into HB 12 as it was introduced, or Senate Bill 1 as it was introduced on the Senate side, is that because of federal law, most often youth who are certified and then are transferred to adult facilities are held in isolation. And that's because they have to be kept sight and sound apart from the adult population. I want you just to imagine the children in your life. Imagine your nieces, your nephews, your nibblings who are in that situation of just being young, and then imagine them apart from everyone else in their life and what that would do to their mental health. It does not create someone who's less likely to engage in future crime. It creates someone who is very much at risk of suicide and at risk of further offenses because they're not getting the help that they need. So the special session on crime is really anything but, and I can't urge you more to object to that type of legislation as it goes forward, and object to the rhetoric that's being put out there that says we're being tough on crime, or Governor Parson is being tough on crime. He's not being tough on crime, he's being tough on children. Now, we did have some uplifting news when it came to that piece of legislation, which was HB 12. Senate Bill 1, which is the original introduced version of this legislation, went up in absolute flames. So then the legislature came back with HB 12. HB 12, as introduced, was the same type of legislation. It was going to say every single year, let's have 307 more certification hearings for youth if they have any crime that is involved with a firearm. To which we said, and so many senators and representatives said, absolutely not. We're not doing that again. So now that measure has come out of committee and it's actually reshaped entirely and become a reform piece of legislation that would raise the age for when we even consider certification for juveniles, that would eliminate drug crimes from the certification proceedings, that would make sure that they have access to educational services, and various reforms like that. And it's become a more, I dare say, somewhat progressive measure when it comes to juvenile justice reform in the United States. If we can hold on to that, what we're saying as Missourians is we value that kids are kids, we know that they can change, and we're saying, let's line up this reform with the reform that we did previously on raise the age, and say that children are going to stay in the system for children and get the services they need. And we know that if we do that, they have the best chance of returning to our society and being contributing members going forward. So we're really at a precipice with this legislation. On Monday, it will come up for a perfection vote on the floor of the House. What that means is that's the time where they can add amendments. What that means for all of us on this call, that's the time where they're going to try to destroy the reform. They're going to try to say, nope, you know what? That's outside the governor's call. We need to go back to making this quote unquote tough on crime. And they just mean tough on kids. So what you can do right now is call your House member and say, I saw that there's a substitute version of House Bill 12, and I support that version. I support making sure that 12-year-olds are not going to end up in the adult system. I support making sure that kids are going to have access to rehabilitative services, and say that they should really stand up for those reforms. Senator Brian Williams, Senator Carla May, and Senator Jamila Nasheed did a fantastic job in the Senate saying no to this piece of legislation. They were in fact the only 3 to do so. I hope that their colleagues will join them on the other side of the building if this bill comes back without any sort of reform measure included in it. So we're in an interesting place. We are crossing our fingers and pushing for that reform bill to stay in place and make it across the line. But you better bet if it changes, we too are going to change our message immediately to make sure that we're not locking up more children and getting horrible results for the state of Missouri. If you want to take action on that, please stay tuned to our social media and Empower Missouri social media so you can stay on top of it, and know that on Monday is when we have the perfection vote, so you'll be hearing more from us then. And if you want to redirect what the governor is doing and say, you know, you shouldn't be having a special session on crime, you should be having a special session on police reform, I encourage you to fill out our petition, which I'm going to drop in the chat as well. And then I will be quiet and answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Any questions for Sarah? There also was a comment earlier from Michelle for Senator Williams drawing his attention to the need to change laws that create some gerrymandering where, you know, for example, let's say down in Jefferson City where there are 2 Department of Corrections facilities that have a very high percentages of people of color who are incarcerated, it changes the demographics for how resources and legislative districts are designated, instead of the cities from which those people, you know, where they used to live before they got moved there, counting as their residence. So some reform about how we do rules in the census and in redistricting, and in general. Why is it people lose their right to vote while they're incarcerated? That doesn't quite make sense to me. I kind of think people ought to still be able to vote. They are still human beings that have needs and ought to, you know, have the right to have a representative and senator to whom they can take concerns. So and be able to vote. So that was drawn to our attention a little bit earlier. Questions for Sarah, or any comment from Senator Williams on the gerrymandering issue?
No, it's something I agree with 100%, and I'm completely open to looking at legislation and figuring out ways that we could really tackle that issue, because I believe that if someone lives in St. Louis, regardless of where they're incarcerated, they should be counted, and their vote should be acknowledged from where they're currently living and not where they're from.
Other questions for Brian or Sarah or Betty, for that matter? She's still on the call, and we appreciate that.
No, I was just going to mention to Sarah, you know, in terms of protections of juveniles, I was echoing her sentiments and saying I even think at some point we need to look at removing the option of consecutive or aggregate sentencing for juveniles and making it retroactive. That's something I'm actually pulling data on and things like that right now. So I think at some point even having that conversation so that it's not being used to constructively circumvent Graham.
I absolutely agree. I think many on this call are familiar with Bobby Bostic's case, a juvenile who was sentenced to 241 years, which everyone knows is life, is far beyond life. But, you know, the Missouri courts have basically said, well, he wasn't sentenced to life. So even though he's only eligible for parole at 114, I believe, we're not considering that life. There is actually a bill that we worked on a bit last session that Representative Nick Schroer filed about consecutive sentences and sort of saying after 15 years that any juvenile sentence would be eligible for a hearing. It doesn't go far enough. There's a lot more we could do there.
Yeah,
but,
I was going to say I read it. Yeah, I read it. I actually received a letter from Bobby a little over a week ago. And when I kind of started, I read a lot of the briefs, and I read the legislation. I said, well, even at 3 years, though, they can say, okay, we've reviewed you. Thank you. Have a great day. Go have a seat. And I was like, you know, the only way to, you know, maybe move that forward and then close the door, because this is problematic, is to look at the whole practice.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think we do have to better protect juveniles and say, you know, if we're going to have this system and this door open at all, that A, we can't ever do this again, and B, we have to be reasonable in terms of, you know, in terms of sentencing if we're going to still have this practice.
Right. Also, I went and met with Bobby Bostic and sat with him for maybe 2 hours or a little bit longer. When I tell you, one of the smartest, kindest, people I've ever, just amazing person I've ever met. And he's taken some tremendous steps in his life, from getting from education. I mean, he's gotten his associate's degree last time I spoke with him. And I mean, has admitted not only a high sense of remorse for what happened several years as a young person, but the judge who sentenced him has shown up to the state capitol on numerous occasions advocating on his behalf, admitting that she shouldn't have sentenced him to the amount of time that she did.
And Judge Baker has turned out on this youth certification issue too that we're facing in the current special session, because she knows better than most judges that judges are not infallible. And she's trying to encourage other judges too to take that standpoint, because if this bill passes as it is, I think we're leading to a possible creation of more Bobby Bostics. And that's what no one wants to see. Bobby has come absolutely so far. He should be getting clemency, frankly. But if that's not an option, we need to make sure that these reforms go through so he can get review. And then we need to make sure that our probation and parole board never again decides to play games as they have with probation and parole before, and instead gives people a meaningful chance at getting out of the Missouri Department of Corrections.
So Sarah, expect me in your email box at some point.
Well,
And I'm not, Stan, let's see if Michelle wanted to say something. You were able to ask a few questions there earlier. Michelle, did you want to unmute yourself and talk? You're welcome to. I had a few messages there. We are nearing the end, so let me make a couple of announcements and then we'll go back to Stan's question if there is time there at the end. I do want to invite people to attend tomorrow's Smart Sentencing Coalition meeting at 11. If you are especially moved by the topics that were talked about on this call today, you may want to be a part of the Smart Sentencing Coalition. You can find that under coalitions on our website and sign up as part of the Smart Sentencing Coalition, or you can just look under events for how to join tomorrow's call and decide whether you want to fill out the sign-on form. We'll be especially talking about the special session tomorrow and our strategy around that. We know that there's a lack of affordable housing in our state and that the coronavirus is creating a situation in which there could be literally just a tsunami of evictions happening in about a month unless some things change. So we have an affordable housing coalition that meets on September the 14th at 2 o'clock. And we're trying to decriminalize HIV status. In our state, you can go to prison if you can't prove that you disclosed your HIV status before you have sex. That can be for as long as 30 years. So we have a justice coalition that includes a lot of people living with HIV and others who care about them and about the issue, who are meeting twice a month. Their next meeting is August the 28th at 1 p.m. Feel free to join. Our next Empowering You webinar will be on September the 17th at 1 o'clock. We'll be focusing on justice at the ballot box and especially on how important it is that we vote no on 3 on November 3rd. That would be undo our clean amendment win that we had from 2018 and redraws the districts in an awful way where children are not counted, and it would be especially disadvantageous to communities of color, what's being proposed. So we'll unpack that fully for you on November 3rd. I don't have speakers to share with you yet, but I promise you they will be experts that you will get a lot from. We want to remind you of how important it is to reach out to Senators Blunt and Hawley right now. You can find resources about that just by going to www.empowermissouri.org. There's a pop-up box that will allow you to get to a template to write Senator Blunt and Senator Hawley. We need them to talk to Mitch McConnell and get him to move, because he's been just absolutely a roadblock to doing sensible coronavirus response that meets the scale of the problem that we are in right now. If you don't get the pop-up, just go to under news and updates and you'll see a box that says COVID-19 call to action. Click on that and you'll find lots of resources there. And then that's how to reach me at Jeanette@empowermissouri.org. So I've made my announcements. Let's see where we are on time. We have 1 minute. Stan, what's your question?
all right, 1 minute, no pressure. All right. Sarah, I've already said, I mean, full disclosure, I've had the the tremendous honor of working with Sara for a season. A lot of respect for her. I want to know, what are we going to do? And I believe this is for Senator Williams, if he can speak on it, if he's still on the line. But if not, I believe Senator Nasheed introduced a bill that will allow it to be, I don't know if it died in the regular session or not, to make it so that people who are incarcerated will be able to vote. Second, and those that are on probation as well. So probation.
Yeah.
Those
Yes, Dan,
go.
she did. I'm not sure what the bill number is, but we'll be looking at, and Sara and I can work together on this, on various pieces of legislation that falls within the scope of criminal justice reform, and figuring out how to keep a lot of that legislation going, whether I'm carrying it or finding another senator who could focus on that issue, and then we all work together to get it done. So I'll look into that, and Sara and I can work together on that, and whatever ways that you want to help with that, we'd be more than happy to have you on board as well.
All right, well, we thank you, Senator Williams, Betty Frizzell, and Sara Baker for being here. Jay, if you're still there somewhere, we thank you also. And thank you to everyone that joined us today. There is certainly plenty for us to do. And as we said at the very beginning, we can be a part of the change. We believe that Black Lives Matter. Police needs to be reformed, and we can take action together to get the job done. So let's not give up until we get it done. Thanks for being with us, and we will see you in many different manifestations between now and next month, I'm sure, when we convene for the Empowering You webinar again. Bye-bye.